Okay, so we're on Lamed Hey Yom and Aleph. We gotten to near the bottom of the page, and just a quick review what the sugya is, so that we can go right into our discussion for this morning. So the question here was whether or not, remember we have the question, the overall question of whether or not someone who the first question was whether or not kefel is sort of an automatic. We've been talking all along that if the person who owes money pays, or he makes, instead of making a shvua, he pays, then he's entitled to kefel. So the Gemara last week in our discussion really parsed that question and made a distinction, as I summarized, between whether or not Bezdin intervened or he did it of his own volition. So in other words, when Bezdin intervenes and says, you're chayiv, you have to pay, then the question is, maybe he's not entitled to kefel in the future. Kefel is, so to speak, a quid pro quo for you're paying the balabais, the owner today, so he's not out anything, and he gives up the right to any future quote-unquote profit, which is what kefel is, and gives it to you. So the Gemara wants to make a distinction, firstly, that really depends on whether or not Bezdin intervenes. If Bezdin intervenes, there's no kefel, because Bezdin is the one who forced you to do it. What was the case? If you remember, the case was where someone lent someone, or he was a shomer over an earring, and he lost the earring, and then all of a sudden, they came to Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman said, you know what, in order to compensate him, we're going to give him this house. And then all of a sudden, the price of the earring doubled. So, and Rav Nachman said, yeah, but when you find the earring, you've got to give it back to the fellow, and he gives back the house. So everyone was up in arms. What do you mean, give it back? It's his. That's quote unquote the kefel. That's what he's entitled to for having paid and not sworn.
Excuse me,
ultimately comes. Sorry.
Excuse me, I'm sorry for being late. Just the refuah shlema Dorit Bas Agnes.
Dorit Bas Agnes. Okay.
Thank you.
So in other words, the question was, why is that right? Why is it right that Rav Nachman said you're going to return the house to the owner and return the earring to the owner when the earring went up in value? And we said that that's quote unquote the kefel. That's what the kefel is. So again, the Gemara makes a distinction between whether the Bezdin intervenes, which is the case here, and when Rav Nachman says when the Bezdin intervenes, then there's no future kefel because he didn't earn the kefel, or the case of our Mishnah where Mishalim below Nishba, he is entitled to kefel. So that is one important distinction. So then the Gemara concluded by saying, so now let's ask a general question. The question is, if a person gives a collateral and the collateral is collected as a result of the fact that something is lost, let's say, question, is that the end of the matter, or can someone redeem the collateral? In other words, I give you my house as a collateral, and then all of a sudden the object of the collateral is found. Can I go back and say, you know what, I want my house back? So that's the interesting question. And we concluded by saying that from Nahardoi, all of where the center of learning, they came back and said, Hilchasa Shumahada La'olam, that a collateral can always be returned. There was some discussion of whether or not it should be for a year or longer. And at the end of the day, we said that it's La'olam, and we quoted a pasuk, which is one of the psukim that we've come across in the past, where it's kind of like a generic covering of doing the right thing. Okay, and what is the right thing? The pasuk doesn't tell us what the right thing is, but we have to understand that the right thing is that he gave a mashkin. The mashkin was simply supposed to be collateral. You collected the collateral, and now there's a chance to redeem the collateral. So why not redeem the collateral? The collateral was not the be-all and end-all at the end. It was sort of hanging there as the interim way of fixing a problem. But if you can fix the problem, i.e. you found the chayfetz, then why not return the chayfetz, get back the collateral, and everybody goes home happy. And that's the way the Gemara concluded last week when we said from the Nerdoi that that was the proper thing to do. Our Gemara now today, we're going to try to parse that a little bit further and understand when that pasuk applies. It doesn't always apply, as he says, yes, it's a good concept. Do the right thing, as he says, but does it apply everywhere? So now our Gemara today is going to show us that it doesn't apply everywhere. But Lamaisa, where we stand right now, is that in the case of that earring, which appreciated in price, and now you have a chance of returning it, you return it, even though it may be double the value of the house. But still, you have to return it. The house goes back to that person, and the earring goes back to that person. So that's where we're holding, and it's about maybe 8 or 9 lines from the bottom. The word pshita.
Oh, Rabbi, excuse me, but so we don't have a concept that collateral is temporary. It's an temporary measure to have something happen, unlike a regular sale, like for chametz or something else. We're not selling it to the guy temporarily.
Right. So you're saying that we don't have a concept that collateral is temporary.
There's no statement that says collateral. The concept of collateral is a temporary transaction.
Right, but for the pasuk, she says a yasher atov, which doesn't specifically speak to collateral.
Right.
It speaks to doing the right thing.
But that's a general statement.
That's a general statement. But the theory, Jay, is that when a person gives collateral, he doesn't mean for that collateral to be the payment for the event that he's doing. He only means it's a placeholder. It's a placeholder.
But why? But there's no statement anywhere in the Gemara or any place else that says the business of collateral is temporary. That it
no, it doesn't.
It's not clearly stated anywhere.
It's not clearly stated that the business is collateral, that it's temporary, except that we apply this principle.
Right.
And the principle of Shisa Yasha applies to more than just collateral, applies to many different things. In other words, doing the right thing trumps any individual sort of category of, yeah, we should do this, but wait a minute, Shisa Yasha, you have to do what's right. And the fellow didn't mean for the collateral to be the payment, he meant it to be a placeholder. So we interpret and say, that's what it is, and if he can repay it, in this case, it was a case of a lost item. So you found the lost item, why not go back to the status quo? The status quo is you get your item, I get my house back, and everybody's happy. So that's kind of where the Gemara, yeah. In other words, that's where we are. But the overall question that we're going to really address further is what's the halacha? In other words, how do we view a situation where somebody gets a hold of property, and now the question is, does he relinquish it or not? That's really the underlying question. The property that you got through any legal source, do you have to relinquish it? I think maybe that's the way to look at the kasha here that we're going to address. Or can you say, no, I got the property, I got it fair and square, it's mine. So that's really the heart of it. So says the Gemara, again, we're about maybe 6, 7, 8 lines from the bottom at the end of the line.
Rabbi, just a quick question for you related to that.
Yeah.
The property that he's putting up as collateral is not equal to what he was borrowing. If he borrowed money, let's say, the collateral is the house or his property. Now, if he can always change that collateral into a monetary amount. In other words, if he owes a person $1,000 and he put up his house for collateral, it's over and beyond what the value was that he borrowed, because it's easier to do that than it is to come up with a price and have it appraised, etc. Whereas they know that he borrowed $1,000. Any which way he can pay back that $1,000 should substitute the taking of the house.
Right, okay, so you would say that that's the Havamina. In other words, I agree with you that the collateral is not necessarily meant to be the payment. It's meant to be sort of what we call the placeholder. And,
Right.
and you can then evaluate what the real number is. But remember, a couple of weeks ago, when we were into the sugya of whether or not I lent you $100, you gave me a collateral. You, the borrower said that collateral was worth $200. And therefore, when I, the lender, lost the collateral, you have assigned it to me for $100. That was the subject of the discussion that we had. In other
Right.
words, the collateral doesn't have to match the loan or doesn't have to be equal to what the situation is. It can be, it shouldn't be less, but it can be
What
more.
you agree on, in other words.
Right, we could agree on it, right?
Yeah.
And then the whole question of Shavua came. Okay, so now if you're going to argue, if I say I lent you $100, you said, yeah, but I gave you my precious pin for $200, and I said, no way, it was $100. Then the whole question there was, do I have to swear? The Gemara says there's no motive of mixture, so you don't have to swear. Different subject, but to your point, the collateral doesn't always measure up to the amount of the loan or whatever is being discussed, and therefore there has to be some adjustment. That we agree. The question is, if there is a dispute on the VAT, if you and I made a transaction and we didn't at the very beginning say this collateral is worth $200, we didn't do that. We relied on the fact that, okay, you're going to pay me anyway, so I'm going to give you back the collateral. What's the big deal? The big deal is that at the end, we're arguing over the value of the collateral, because depending on what it's worth, I owe you money or not. So the whole idea, the principle that you're posing, and also Jay said before, collateral is not meant to be the end game. Collateral is meant to be an interim way of
It's a secured.
facilitating a monetary event, and at the end we'll sort it out, right? Either you owe me, depending on what the nature is. The problem is we get that collateral gets embroiled in a machlokes. How much is it really worth? Because no one went ahead and got an evaluation. So now you and I are arguing, how much is the collateral worth? I say it's worth my loan. You say it's worth double the size of the loan. That's where the problem arises, because now we're going to have to make some adjustments. And the machlokes says, what adjustments are we making? That's where the Gemara gets into all of this. And that's why the whole Asisa V'Sayasha V'Satayv is really a way of saying, guys, you're going to enter into a transaction, enter into it the right way. A, make sure that all the details are ironed out at the outset, which of course should always be the number one priority. But even if you haven't completely done it, and now we're beyond that, and we're saying now the question is, well, is he going to keep the collateral? Is he not going to keep the collateral? Then Osisa V'Sayasha V'Satayv comes back to tell us, you know what? Okay, you guys didn't sort it out at the beginning. You don't know the full value of the collateral, but at the very least, let's not make this collateral the football. Let's work it out so that if he wants the collateral back, he'll pay money for it because of Asisa V'Sayasha V'Satayv. So it's kind of like a two-stage. And again, the Gemara is very moral here. It's saying when two people enter into any transaction, enter into it, and lahavdil. I mean, that's what we do today in our written documents when we, sometimes for a transaction, you have 89 pages of documents. What the heck do I need 89 pages for a simple transaction? And that's because all the fine print is out there to make sure that nobody is misunderstanding the nature of the deal. Sometimes those 89 make it more problematic than less. But the point of the matter is Hasisha, there's Yasser Satayv. The whole principle is let's get it right the first time. Let's have an agreement. Everybody should know what the agreement is. Everybody should know what happens if the agreement falls apart, so that we're not having machlokes later on. That's the purpose of Hasisha Yasser Satayv. And the Gemara is telling us that really, with regard to collateral, which is our subject, is the way to go. In other words, collateral is not meant to be the final payment. It's meant to be an interim what we call a stopgap, and at the end of the day, we'll sort it out. So that's where the Gemara is right now. So now we're going to pick up, and we're going to discuss further this whole concept of collateral, so to speak. Says the Gemara Pshita. The Gemara says it's pretty obvious. What's obvious? So now the Gemara is going to give us an example of something that we're going to take away from this whole sugya that is very obvious. What's obvious? Here's the case study. In other words, there's a Bal Chayv, right? There's someone owes somebody else. He has a creditor who he owes money, and so there's a machlokes here. Comes the Bezdin, and it takes the collateral and gives it to the Bal Chayv, to the creditor. Okay, Shamalei the Bal Chayv. Okay, now he has the creditor has it, and it's all fine and good. Now what happens? Well, also Ihu, the creditor goes ahead. The sum of the Bal Chayv today. That creditor has his own creditor from another Maisa, from another loan. So now what the Bezdin gave him as being a creditor, he flips to a different creditor. Question: what do you do with that item? Is that item now returnable to the original debtor or not? I'll ask you the question. In other words, does the debtor have a right to something that was taken from him and given to a creditor, and that creditor paid another creditor? In other words, we're now one generation removed. Does he have any rights here? That's the question. That's the Gemara's kasha. Does Asisav a Yashav Atayv apply sort of one generation later, one step later? Amrina and Lay, says the Gemara, at Megavra de Asamine. The answer is that you, the second creditor, aren't better than the first creditor. In other words, your rights are derived from the first creditor. The first creditor has rights only up to the point where if it can be redeemed, it's redeemed. So now, says the Gemara, Pshita, it's obvious that the second creditor is no better than the first creditor. And if you can redeem the collateral from the first creditor, you can definitely redeem it from the second creditor. That's what the Gemara wants to now say as a Pshita. It's obvious. So everything we've said, why is that? I go back to the pasuk. Because you're supposed to do the right thing. The right thing means doesn't stop with the first creditor. It keeps going. And if you can make something whole the way it was at the very beginning, this principle of Sisavis Yashav Asatayv applies. And this is so we call this a sui generic principle that the halacha tells us that's the way a Jew should behave. In other words, try to right the ship the way it was before the transaction happened. There are times when you can't do that. But if you can do that, then as a matter of principle, and halachically speaking, that's how we really, all the poskim, I think for the most part, will try to interpret that in the positive way, in saying that Asisa Yosef Satayv, that you should try to maintain what we call the status quo, the equilibrium. Now the Gemara is going to tell us there are cases where that definitely doesn't happen. So now we've said Asisa Yosef Satayv, you have to try to make it happen. Says the Gemara, there are clear exceptions to that rule, and there's an underlying reason for the exception. So now we're going to understand.
Rabbi, can I ask a question on this? Is the premise here that the person who put up the collateral forever has the right to redeem it from wherever it goes? So it reverts to him in the end. So in essence, you never can dispose of that completely. You have to retain the value to that.
That's exactly what it seems to be saying. And we quoted the Talmidei Chachamim from Nerdoi, who were the leading sort of philosophers of the time, and they came across and said, yes, there was one thought that it should only be for a year. After a year, it kind of goes away. And the answer was that this pasuk, Asisa Yasher Vesatayv, allows you to come back even 5 years later and say, I would like my collateral back. So the answer to your question is yes, that collateral is not an end all, a be all, it is an interim phase. There are times when it will morph into an end all, but it's not meant to be. It's not meant to be.
Does the original creditor who passes on the second, does he have an obligation to inform when he passes that collateral on to repay his debt that it is subject to reversion?
No. No, he has no obligation. He should say, I'm giving you collateral that I myself got as collateral, but if he doesn't do it, then okay. Now the question comes, the debtor has the money, he goes to the creditor says, I gave it up to Shimon already, Shimon has it. He then goes to Shimon and says, Shimon, I want it back. He says, what do you mean you want it back? This is collateral that Levi gave me. Yeah, but you're not better than Levi, and I could have gotten it from Levi. I can get it from you too. So you know what'll happen? They'll go to Beis Din, they'll fight over it, and Beis Din will say, you have to do the right thing, you have to give it back to him. So that's how that will play out. But now let's take a look at this Gemara as we go forward. There are exceptions to that rule, because, but Michael, what you hit on is a very important question. If there's no certainty and there's tumult all over, when are we ever going to be able to resolve anything? That's what you're really asking. How do we get to a definitive result that something is over and it's over? If it's never over, then you're always going to be susceptible to someone coming in the middle of the night, knocking on your door and say, give me this back. What do you mean, give it to me back? It's mine. She said, you have to give it to me. So we're trying to get to a resolution to avoid that problem. Okay, so now says the Gemara, now here are the exceptions. Okay, so now we said that you have to return it. However, Zavna means he sold it. Remember, here he gave it to the second creditor as a collateral. What happens if he sold it and got money for it? Urta, he gave it as a Yerusha. He gave it to his son as a Yerusha. Urta, b'matana, or he has a very dear friend or his wife or anybody else, and he says, I'm giving you a gift here, this beautiful ring, I'm giving you as a gift. In other words, he's doing something which is not, what is collateral? Collateral by definition is kind of an interim holding of property in order to facilitate a deal or a matter, and then it gets resolved. So by definition, if I were to ask you about collateral, I'd ask anybody who doesn't know a whole lot, what is collateral? And someone would say, yeah, that's something that you give to somebody else in exchange for an event, but it's not meant for him to keep it. It's meant for him to hold it up to a period of time. That is a very layman's way of explaining collateral.
It's sort of, it's like term life insurance. Although there's actual money they can spend it, but the point is it's something that's temporary that you hope you never have to use it.
It's security. It's a security interest in case you aren't able to fulfill your obligation.
Right. But wouldn't you all agree that it does not have a sense of permanence? That by definition, collateral does not mean permanent.
Unless the condition is not met.
Well, okay, but we didn't say that. We didn't say that. We said the event of giving collateral from moving to Shimon is meant to be a temporary matter until something can be resolved. That's how we look at collateral. Says the Gemara, I agree with you, but there are times when a transaction goes beyond collateral, it goes into permanence. What is that? Zavna, if he sold him the property, or he inherited the property, or he gave it by matana. These are things which are meant to be permanent. They're not meant to be temporary like collateral. They're meant to be permanent. All three of those are meant. I give a Yerusha to my child. That's meant to be permanent. I'm giving him a Yerusha. I'm not giving him collateral, I'm not giving him something that later on there'll be a dispute, the question of whether or not it has to be returned or not. I give you a gift. I like you, I give you a gift. Does that gift have strings attached to it? No, it means I'm giving you a gift and it's now yours. By definition, it means it's yours.
Rabbi, but a Yerusha, isn't the child stepping into the same shoes as the parent? In other words, it holds on. If it's going to be that another creditor steps into the shoes, why isn't an inheritance the same thing?
So that's where the distinction comes in. You're right. And the Gemara says we're going to make a distinction between the case of one creditor giving collateral to another creditor and the Yerusha, which is meant by definition to be something permanently transferred from a parent to a child or whoever is giving the Yerusha. So in other words, you're asking the right question, but the answer is no. It's not meant to be the same. It's meant to be a more definitive concept of this is now yours, 100% yours. Asisa v'yasher v'satayv doesn't come into play here. Okay, so having said that,
Why, excuse me, Rabbi, why doesn't the Gemara come and take the side of the borrower? Hey, he's in tough condition. He needs the money for something. He should be protected and not allow this collateral to ever go into the permanent category.
so to a point, Jay, you're 100% right. The Chachamim are looking to protect the borrower, but they're also looking at the whole picture and realizing that if all we do is protect the borrower, we're creating chaos, literally, in any transaction, because there will always be this dangling question of, is it over? There's got to be finality somewhere. So we're going to bend over backwards to let the borrower have as much leeway as possible, even for a year or 2 or 3, as the people in Nadori said. But at the end of the day, depending on how that item was transferred, depending on how it was transferred, we're going to say there is finality. So in the case of a creditor, where it's literally collateral that could be sitting on a shelf for 5 years until someone comes along and says, I'm redeeming that, and according to this sugya, you can do that. In counter-distinction, if I say, you know what, this thing's been sitting here, I really, I'm not going to let it sit forever. I'm going to sell it.
Yeah.
Now that I sell it, I have the money, but I'm going to sell it because that's what at some point you have to do. Then that sale becomes the demarcation line between the balance of the love and the balance of the malva.
So why did the Chachamim ever allow the collateral to be used to a second creditor? Just stop it with that one situation and not let it go beyond that. They could have decreed you can't take the collateral and use it for a collateral for you. You have your own problems. They could have stopped the whole thing instead of all of these exceptions. Why should it? It should never be able to go to anything else. It stays with the first. The creditor keeps the collateral, and that's where it stops. He can't do anything with it because he can't use it up. He basically can't sell it.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thought, but I think what's going on here is, remember, the bottom line is the Chachamim or the Poskim or the Rabbanim, whoever, are not trying to thwart Mekech and Memker, the normal commerce that goes on between people. Otherwise, there's a total standstill and we can do nothing. No one can borrow, no one can lend, no one can do anything. There has to be a normalcy that I'm going to lend you money, and I have to know that if you're giving me collateral and somehow you don't repay, then I'm not stuck forever. Otherwise, people will say, why should I enter into a transaction with another Jew when I'm being hampered by so many difficulties?
But the borrower knows when he gives the lender the collateral, he knows that he can get it back. That's part of it. And it's guaranteed that he can get it back. and they shouldn't allow it to go to other generations. And it should be used just for the benefit of the borrower.
Okay, but then I'll counter that by telling you, we've had sugyas in the Gemara before where the borrower gave the collateral, and in the back of his mind, he said, I'm giving this as collateral, but he says to himself, I'm not sure about this loan, whether I'll ever be able to repay it. I'm not going to tell that to the Malva. I'm not going to tell the Malva that he just lent me $100 that I may never be able to pay him back.
That's normal. That's normal thinking.
What?
That's normal thinking. And
So if we're going to allow him to have complete latitude to say, but you can't do anything with my collateral until I pay you back, that's almost a fallacy in the beginning, because his whole havamina was he needs the money today, and the Rabbi Shalom will help him by somehow finding a way to repay. And that's all fine and good. He has a munah chachamim, he has the munah the Rabbi Shalom. But at the same time, we have to be practical. The Gemara is practical, and the halacha is practical. There is a collateral here, which the malveh, the lender, is counting on to be his repayment. So if he lends it to him for a year, okay, here he pay me back in a year. The year comes, the lover has no havamina paying back. He has no money. So what's the mal? You're going to make the malveh now be stuck for another year and another year and another year. In other words, a sisa is a yasher and a esatoiv is a way to help, in this particular case, to help the loveh, but not thwart the malveh from not wanting to enter into an arrangement to help somebody. Because if you're going to tell him, by the way, this little principle of Sisha V'Yasar type means you can never touch this collateral. This collateral is going to be in your possession until your great-grandchildren are alive. Then he's going to say, why would I do that? Why would I tie up $100 for generations when I can't get a hold of the money? And again, as we go further in the Gemara, we're going to see how complicated that becomes.
But he can put it to use.
Transaction takes place, they should be required for any transaction to state an end date, 1 year, 2 year, or whatever.
But in most, that's true. And in most shtaros, there is such a, when we talk about shtaros, which we have in the past, that we do have specifics saying Reuven lent Shimon for a year, and on Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, a year from now, you have to repay. Okay, he comes back and says, Reuven, my friend, I don't have the money. So then he says, okay, I'm taking the collateral because that's what that's what's stipulated. Okay, I don't have a brayer. Then 15 days into Tammuz, he wins the lottery and he has a windfall, and he comes back to Reuven and says, oh, wait a minute, Reuven, I now have the money to pay you back. What do we do? Says the Gemara, since it was not really what he wanted to do. Now, Reuven, in the meantime, uses that collateral for his own loan, right? That's what the Gemara says. He gives it to Levi. And Levi says, I owe you money. Here's the collateral. And Levi says, oh, I'm delighted. You're paying me back. Now comes Shimon comes back and he says to him, wait a minute. You got to give that back because here's the $100. He says, I don't want the $100. I have the collateral. Says the Gemara, Levi is not better than Shimon was. So now, in other words, if Shimon was responsible to repay, then Levi is responsible to repay. Again, it's a concept that sometimes gets in the way of reality, because the reality is that everybody who enters in, they want to do the right thing, but they don't want something to be infinite. They want finality.
So there's really no way to guarantee protection for the lender,
right?
Protection for the borrower,
right?
Things, and also the fact that the commerce should not be stifled because of any of these restrictions. But when you have these three things competing for attention,
right?
There's no one solution.
There's no one solution. Comes the Gemara and says, Jay, you're right, but we're going to carve out exceptions to when there is finality. You're right. Finality is transitory. It doesn't have any mamoshes. But in order to make things really right in the world, we're going to say that there is finality. When you sell it, Again, we're going to go explain in a minute.
Okay, I
When
got
you
you.
sell it, when you give it for your Yerusha, when you give it for a matana, those are final, irreversible events. Now let's just stop a minute and let's see why. The Gemara right away gives an example and says, "Vani haimi kora adata da aranachos, v'lava data de zuzanachos." Here's the key. The key is that in those three cases, your intention was the object, not the money behind the object. When you sold something, you sold an object. You have an artifact, Jay, and you want to sell me that artifact. I like it. I want to buy it. I'm not buying it because it's worth $100 or because it's worth $200. I want the object. So when you sell the object, the intention of the parties is to transact on that object. When I give you collateral, the objective is not for you to keep the collateral, it's to hold something until I can repay you. So the whole principle of collateral is a little bit more illusory than oh, you're giving me this nice pin. This is going to be my heirloom forever. That wasn't the intent. But when I sell you something, I'm selling you a chayfetz. I'm not selling you money. I'm selling you a chayfetz. When I give you a matana, I like you. I want to give you a matana. This is the matana I want to give you. I don't want to give you $100 worth of this matana. I want to give you the matana. So the Gemara says, as a matter of principle, these three things, the parties transact the object, not the money behind the object. In a loan, it's simply the money behind the object. The collateral wasn't meant to be the be all and end all. It was as a stopgap until I can repay you. And that, says the Gemara, is a big difference. And therefore, those three items are final. There's no, in other words, the asisa is a yashav esatayv doesn't apply. That whole wonderful pasuk of doing the right thing does not apply in a case where you and I transacted a deal on something specific that you wanted to sell to me and I wanted to buy from you. Okay, so that's clear from the Gemara. That's why those three stand out. Okay, so now we've answered an important question. That there are times when a sisa v'sayashav v'satayv does not apply, and the reason why it doesn't apply is because it is outside the realm of what you and I contemplate. Now, the Gemara goes on with another different example. Somolo leisha, the incident. What happens if a woman is owed money and Bezdin intervenes and gets her the money? In other words, she's a creditor, but she doesn't have, she's not an aggressive woman, so she does not do it on herself. Bezdin steps in and Bezdin gets her the money, $100. The insive, she gets married. Okay, now we're entering into the world of nichse malug. Remember, we had a couple of weeks ago that there's two different types of property. When a husband marries a woman, then there is a property which he becomes an outright owner to, and then and that's part of the ksuba. And there's also property called nichse malug, which she remains always the owner, but he has entitlement to the fruit of that property while they are married. But if there is a divorce or the ksuba comes into effect, he is not an owner. That was okay. So now this woman gets the bezdin to give her money because she's a creditor. The insive, someone minay de isha, the insive, or someone claims against this woman and say, "You owe me money," and the bezdin says, "Right," and they go to the woman and they take away that money because she owes it. Okay, they take away the $100, the insive, and she gets married. So in either case, there is $100 that either she has before marriage and gets married, and marriage is the important concept here, or they take away from her before she gets married and then she gets married. Now, umesa, she dies. So she dies, leaving this money kind of, let's call it limbo for the time being. What's the definition of this money? Who owns this money? So says the Gemara, Baal benichte ishta lo keyachava, lo mahada v'lo mahadrinen. So wait a minute. A husband to his wife is a lokeach. What is a lokeach? A buyer. What did we just say about a buyer? We just said that buying and selling is definitive. There's no going back. It's not wishy-washy anymore. So if he's a buyer and he was a buyer before she died, he was a buyer the minute he married her. So if he was a buyer, then, and so let's say the creditor, let's say the credit the woman got was a beautiful pin, right? And then she married this gentleman. He is a lokeach. She dies. The owner of the pin comes and says, wait a minute, that pin, give it back to me because I'm going to pay for it. I'm going to give you the $100 for the pin. Says the Gemara, he's a lokeach. And as a lokeach, it's a definitive sale. He doesn't have to give back the pin because he bought it. How did he buy it? Because by marrying the woman, he became a lokeach. He became the purchaser. Anything she owns, he owns as a purchaser. So a third person can't come and say, Asisa sayashiv asatayv, you got to give it back to me. It was meant to be collateral. Teretz is, it was collateral up to the point where he married her. Yes, it may have been collateral at one point in time. I'm not going to argue with it. But once he married her, it changes the status of the relationship. It's as if she sold it to him. Now, we just said before that we have collateral, and then all of a sudden you sell that collateral. If you sell the collateral, it's too late. You can't come back and say, I want to recollect, I want to collect my collateral. It's too late. It was sold. A sale is a definitive event. Why? As we said, because sale is one of those things that you don't sell the value, you sell the chayfetz, the thing. A matana, it's the thing. A yerusha, it's the thing. So we're making a distinction between what we normally would think to be a mashkin, collateral. Yes, it's something that I can get back. And again, sometimes there may be a machlokes that goes to Bezdin, and two people argue, I didn't mean that to be the be all and end all. I meant that to be collateral. So the Bezdin is going to have to make a decision whether or not what you gave is collateral or a sale. And this
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. My computer cut out here, so if it's already addressed this, I apologize. You know, a lot of times I'll give tzedakah to computer stop. A lot of times I'll give a tzedakah to somebody, and I'll say, "Yeah, take this to the to the kotel and give tzedakah." But it doesn't have to be this particular dollar. It could be any dollar. Right. Are we talking about the same thing that you're saying that you're not saying that particular item, you're talking about the value of that item. And I specifically said that when I gave it to tzedakah.
Right. Okay. So tzedakah, by the way, is a different realm. I mean, we're talking about something really different as opposed
collateral.
To collateral in a transaction, right? But your point is that when I make a more general statement and say, I want to give this thing away, then it's almost like Bikurim or anything else. I can substitute it for something of equal value and give it away. In other words, you gave me a Lincoln silver certificate. Do I have to give the Lincoln silver certificate, or can I give them a Federal Reserve note from another year? I mean, that's kind of what the distinction is. And the answer is, of course, you can substitute one for the other. But we're talking now about something that is distinctive. Collateral is distinctive. It's not just another piece of something. It's a piece of jewelry. It's a piece of something that he wants back, but he needs to give it to the guy in order to get the money to do what he needs to do. So in the back of his mind, he never meant to give him that piece of jewelry. He always meant to give him something to get back. That's the key. Once
like a pawn shop.
Like a pawn shop. Very good. In other words, I'm not giving it to you to sell. Yes, we have an agreement. If I don't come back in 45 days, you can sell it. But in that 45 days, it's mine. It's still mine. And you can't come back and say, you know what, I got, the pawn shop owner says, I got attached to this item. Yeah, you can negotiate a better price if you want to get more money, but he can't take it from you because it was never meant to be a taking. These items, a purchase is not, oh, I'm selling you this, but if you don't like it a year from now, I'll buy it back. That's not what a purchase is. A purchase is a definitive sale with a bill of sale between two people, or I give my child a Yerusha, and the Yerusha happens to be something individual, not something generic. And I say, I want you to have this. This is yours. Can someone come and say, wait a minute, how did you give it to your child, the Yerusha? That belongs to me. That was mine. So Teretz is, a Yerusha is finite, because the Yerusha wasn't meant to be a collateral for something else. A matana isn't meant to be, I want to give you a gift, and the gift I give you is this particular ring. Can I substitute it for another ring? Why? I wanted to give you that ring. That ring meant something from me to you, and I want to give you that ring. So in this case, where the woman is a creditor and she gets something of value, and now she marries, and then she dies. So look at the progression. She got something of value. Okay, question whether or not that's fungible or not. Now she goes ahead and marries. Oh, wait a minute. There's a halacha on marriage between a man and a woman. The halacha is that the man becomes the purchaser, the lokeach of what the woman owns. Yeah, we can say, depending on whether it's nichse melug, meaning the temporary property, or son barzel, which is the permanent property. But for our discussion purposes, let's say it's the permanent property. If it's the permanent property, I'm now a buyer. There's nothing better than a buyer. A buyer is inviolate. No one can come to a buyer and say, give me back what was purchased here because it was collateral. Sorry, too late. It loses its status of collateral and becomes a purchase which is permanent. So that's what the Gemara is telling us. And so it's telling us two things. It's telling us, first of all, it's proving to us that a purchase is permanent, but it's also telling us that a husband who marries, depending on which property we're talking about, becomes a inherent owner right away. Of course, in this case, the wife dies, but once he marries her, he becomes a lokeach, so that if she dies and he's holding this collateral from somebody else, and the somebody else wants the collateral back, the answer is, sorry, someone else bought it. Who? The husband. He bought it. And buying is a definitive act that does not allow for retrieval. Yeah, Mike.
But
Rabbi, explain the, so he becomes lokeach when he gets married.
Correct.
So if she stays alive,
Yes.
it's still partly hers. They co-own it, so it's still in play. So the borrower can reclaim it. But if she dies, it completely goes over. Is there a distinction between life and death here?
No. Let me stop you. It is not in play. You said it's in play. The minute she marries him, he steps in as a purchaser of the property she owns. As long as she is not married, that collateral might be in play, as you call it. It could be in play. The guy says, I didn't mean, blah, blah, blah. The minute she marries, it changes, it becomes sold property. The minute she marries, let me repeat it. The minute she marries the guy, it becomes sold property. He is the purchaser.
So Unesa has nothing to do with this status. She happened to die, but even if she was alive, that would mean that he's a lokeach.
Correct.
And nothing can be done about it.
Nothing can be done. Nothing can be done. So if that fellow comes and says, you know, Mrs. So-and-so, you know, I really meant to give that to you as collateral, not as a purchase. Answer is, what do you mean? I already have, I sold it. Who'd you sell it to? My husband. My husband is the buyer. That's why lokeach is such an important concept, because the minute it becomes defined as a sale, it goes out of the category of okay, it's Hasisa v'Sayashiv v'Satayv. No more Hasisa v'Yashiv v'Satayv, because you've done something definitive. And sometimes this is a harder concept to understand, because if we want to do, quote, the right thing, then why does the right thing not apply even to sales? The Gemara, remember, the Gemara here, this whole concept of our discussion is, and I think you said it before, there's three parties here. There is a malva, there is a lova, there's a transaction, but that looming on top of that is the question of commerce. Commerce is the third party here, and if commerce is the third party, and we're going to say, you know what, it doesn't matter, commerce be whatever, we're always going to allow the malva and the lova to play with each other in terms of the property, then you're going to upend the normalcy of what the Gemara is trying to say. We have to have a normal system of mekach and memkar. Asisa Yashar type is a wonderful concept, but there's got to be normalcy. If there isn't normalcy, then it's hefker, and we don't believe in hefker. We don't believe that everything should be, sleight of hand. Today yes, tomorrow no. So if we want normalcy, we balance normalcy with hasisa v'sayasha v'satayv. But there are times when normalcy trumps. Normalcy trumps hasisa v'sayasha v'satayv. When you sell it. When you sell it, that's normal. That's the normal course of a transaction.
But
that's what the Gemara is trying to impress upon us. Yeah.
Let's assume for the moment that the collateral is exactly worth the amount of the loan, because when it's not, then it really gets complicated.
Right.
So this person borrowed $100 from the woman, gave an item that's this pin that's worth $100. She gets married, she dies, etc. So he comes back. He's been saving up now for the last 6 months to be able to pay back this $100, and he goes there and then finds out, oh, too late. This is, she got married, she died. I've got this thing. I like this pin, so I'm not giving it back, and I don't have to because now I own it, etc. But it's then, so really then what should happen though is at that same moment, whether it's when she married or when she died, that the effective transaction happened, there should have been some go out saying, okay, now the loan is void. No? In other words,
how can something get lost in
No. But Nasha, the loan isn't void. There still is a loan that has to be repaid. It's just that it cannot be repaid from that item because that item is now off limits because it was sold. She still owes $100. She still owes $100 for sure.
Okay, so the borrower still owes $100. He goes back to pay the $100, and the husband says, and he says, and I want the collateral back. And the husband says, too late.
I bought it. I
effectively bought it. So, and I like it. So I don't want to just give that back. Does he then have to turn around and say, okay, now I give you $100, which effectively means that the loan is the
loan is still the loan, right? He has
the loan is still the loan, and the fact that and the collateral, the value of the collateral still counts. In other words,
correct.
Okay, so the value of the collateral still counts. It just doesn't have to be that item.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And if the woman gets divorced, she, depending upon what property it was, she may still have control of that collateral.
Right. So now that's an interesting question.
But at that point, the collateral is already, it's still effectively null and void in terms of it being that one.
Why did
Commerce? So hold on. We're getting to it. So David, if she gets divorced, then the question is, does that transaction under the ksuba, where he becomes the owner, the lokeach, is that a valid transaction? And arguably, you could say it's not a valid transaction because he no longer has the right to it. That right was taken away from him through the divorce. Remember, because the kesubah controls everything. So if it was taken away from him, then he can no longer taina, it's mine, I don't have to return it to you.
But
right?
But what if
you upended the chain of ownership.
But hypothetically,
the commerce partner loses out.
Go back to the same case again. So let's say in the middle, while she's married, the borrower comes over and says, I really love this pin. Can I just take a look at it? Take a picture of it, and she says, well, I'm sorry, I got married and now it's my husband's and he decided he likes it. And so he's bought it. And so then he's all upset, he goes away, but finally a month later, after she's divorced, he comes back to pay, and she's now got this thing as part of the divorce agreement. She ended up back with this item again, but he already knows that the status has changed. Is the status changed twice, or is the status retroactively undone and back to the original?
The status changed. It went from lekuchos
Right.
to being undone as a lekuchos. There are times when a sale is undone for moral reasons or for other reasons. In other words, when we say a sale, we mean a sale that is a permanent sale. Is there something about a sale that one could say, oh, wait a minute, you tricked her or it was stolen? Yes, a sale can be upended if it isn't a legitimate sale. So when we say that a sale breaks the chain, it means a legitimate sale that stands. If that sale somehow falls apart, i.e. a divorce, or it was found to be a stolen item, then wait a minute, you had no right to sell that item. Then we can undo the sale, but for different reasons having nothing to do with the transaction of the borrowing, right? In other words, we're going to upend the sale and say it's not a sale and status quo from before, but that's because the sale became invalid.
Mekach to'os, and it's government.
Mekach tos, or any other reason like that. Exactly. So that just adds a little bit of a wrinkle here. But what the Gemara is being mechadish here is, in this particular event, is that the woman, once she marries, the status of that property changes even in her lifetime, i.e. the husband is a purchaser, and depending on whether it's nichse malug or not. Now let's talk about nichse malug for 1 minute, because that's also important. What is nichse malug? Nichse malug means that she has certain dowry property that belongs to her. It will belong to her now and in the future always, but the husband has the rights to the payers. In other words, while they're married, if it's a field, he gets all the payers. Okay, what happens if she dies? What happens to the nichse malug? I'm getting a little bit ahead of ourselves by telling you that the Gemara, that the halacha will be, the Torah will be, that he becomes the owner of the nichse malug. Listen to this. Even if she went ahead and sold, let's say this was a businesswoman, and she had nichse malug, and she knew what to do with it. She went to you, David, and said, you know what, when I die, you're the owner of this. You're not my husband, but I want to sell this to you so that when I die, it's yours. It's yours. She dies. You come and say, Mrs. So-and-so sold me this property. Teretz is, you're too late, because even in nichse malug, the husband has kedima to become a purchaser. So even though in life, nichse malug, the husband had no more rights than the rights of a sharecropper to take the food, but nothing more, upon her death, he becomes a lokeach. And he was the first lokeach before she came to you, David, and said, I want to sell it to you. So that's the big chiddush, that in nichse malug, he also is a lokeach. But bottom line, a lokeach trumps everybody, because lokeach is one of the exceptions to the rule that quote unquote, you can't treat it as fungible collateral and say, I never meant to use it. I meant to use it as a stopgap, and therefore I want it back. No, not so. There are exceptions to the rule. Most of the time, a sisa, as a yashav, as a toiv will be the overarching principle. Let's do the right thing. But there are times when we say that even a sisa, yashav, as a toiv has its limits, and purchasing a lokeach is one of those limits. Otherwise, it's like Michael and everybody else said, we're going to have a totally chaotic system of commerce, and people won't know what side is up, and they won't know when they borrow or when they lend money what's going on, and maybe that collateral will be held up for years and years and years. And you know what? People want finality. People want to come in I'm happy to help. I'll lend you the money, but there's a finality to this deal. You don't pay me, I get this, I walk home. Don't tell me 5 years later you can come and redeem it. I already used this thing. I gave it to my child for a matana. I gave it for a Yerusha. I did this, I did that. So it's a delicate balance between helping a lover. Remember, this is all about the lover. This is all about the borrower trying to protect him so that he should have some options. And we say, sure, we're going to give you options, but there's got to be a limit to what we're giving you, because we have to keep the malveh and his life in context. And that's the balance that this Gemara is teaching us, is that there are times when a malveh has to give in, and there are times when the malveh can say, no, I did the right thing, and I know that you want it back, but I gave it to a matana or I sold it, farfallen. And this whole case of the woman with her husband, I mean, it's a side point to give us, to let us understand the rule, but it wants to tell us that the rule is that if a husband is the lokeach, he's the same lokeach as you would be, David, if I sold it to you. That husband is the same right of lekuchos, and no one can take it away from him. And that's really what the Gemara is after here. So it's a fascinating, but again, I mean, it's real life. And in real life, you have to have balances. You have to have, people have to know what they're doing. You can't just say, I can take it, and today and tomorrow you can get it back, and it's hefker, and this, that, the other. And again, we're talking in an era, and we've said this so many times, when things were written maybe on the back of an envelope, there wasn't a clear star, there wasn't a clear agreement, people didn't know what one person was, what his intent was. That makes it very, very complicated. Today, I can say it's probably, it almost never happens, because today, if it's drafted properly, an agreement will be ironclad, and will say what the party's intention was, what the rights are. Now, this whole right of collateral doesn't really play so much in common law, but if I wanted it to play in common law, and I gave you something to hold for me, and you said, okay, I'm going to hold this for 90 days, and after which it becomes mine, like a pawn shop, someone said, then that's exactly right. So for 90 days, you have the right to redeem. After 90 days, you don't have the right to redeem anymore. It's clear on the document, you don't have the right to redeem. So anyway, those are some of the nuances. Let's just finish the bottom line, because that's a good endpoint. So the Omar of Yosi Bar Chanina, because Yosi Bar Chanina says, "Usha hiskinu." In Usha, as the Gemara says, was one when the Bezdin moved from Yerushalayim. It went to, according to the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, it went to 10 different places, and the Bezdin set up shop. So when it was in the place called Usha, they paskined as follows: for Isha shemachra benichse melug b'chaye bala umesa. This is what we said before. A woman who sells nichse melug. Nichse melug is the temporary property. B'chaye bala, while her husband is alive, umesa, and she dies. Abal motzi miyata lekuchos. So in my example to you, David, where the wife sold you the property and you owned it, and then she died, and now you come and say, I bought Mrs. So-and-so, sold me the property, I'm the proper owner, and it says lekuchos are inviolate, you can't take it away from me. Teretz is the husband always becomes the first lokeach, and therefore, and by the way, that's not the normal thinking. We should say that if she transacted with you, you are the buyer. Says the Gemara, the Bezdin made this following chiddush, that as once they're married, the husband becomes the lokeach, even with nichse muluk. Now, if it's tzon barzel, which is something that he has the right to at the very beginning of the marriage, okay, I get it. But nichse muluk, he has no rights to, other than being a sharecropper where he can take it day by day. He has no rights to that property. Says the Gemara that in this particular case, we're going to overrule that principle. We're going to overrule that principle and say that even the nichse malug becomes transactional property that the husband purchased at the time of the marriage, even though he didn't own it. He didn't own it. He only owned rights, right? He only owned rights. So why should he take it? Teretz is that we treat him as a lokeach, and we say that a lokeach is inviolate. When you sell something, it is forever. It's not undoable, and therefore he has the rights to the property. That's how the Gemara works.
Rabbi, one last clarifying point. If the husband died,
Yes.
it still changes.
If the husband died, then it's still the wife who owns it.
The wife owns it back again, but the collateral, the person who puts up the collateral doesn't have the right to get it because it had already transferred. And now it reverts, it's already changed, so they don't have the right to get it. Am I right about that? It's lokeach stops everything.
Right, but so what you're asking is, since the lokeach stops everything, but the husband died, so he's no longer a lokeach. He's no longer a lokeach. Who's the lokeach after the husband?
The wife, unless there's he gives some of his estate elsewhere.
So you answered it. The wife now owns it. Now I come along and say, that was collateral, Mrs. I'd like it back.
But it changed already. The lokeach, you said, changed the situation. So does it revert in that case?
It reverts back because there's no lokeach.
So the buyer disappears.
Unless there's one unless, and that is the yorshim of the lokeach. Let's say that marriage had children,
right?
And that husband had a son or a daughter,
right.
and
left it to the.
And they say, wait a minute, my father was the lokeach. I am the inheritor of my father. I'm the lokeach. Then you're 100% right. The original guy is out of luck because it already changed permanent. Okay, but what happens if there was a childless marriage and he died? He died. So that there's no longer a lokeach. It's hefker, not hefker.
So at that point, his death reverts it back to what it was before, even though it was community property.
Correct. So now she is the holder and the owner of that property. And the chayra, if someone comes and says, you know what, that was just collateral, I didn't mean to give it up forever, then you've got a fight on your hands. Again, a sisivus, a yashav v'shatayiv, the bezdin is going to have to make a delicate decision on whether or not this is hasisa v'yashav v'shatayiv. Why? Because it was already sold. You see, you were adding a little spice to this question by saying it was already sold. So if it wasn't sold, then you could argue, wait a minute, it already changed possession. It can never go back.
That's what I'm asking.
That's what you're asking. Can it ever go back? It's a very good question.
That's a corollary to what I was saying. He's saying when the husband dies, and I was saying in the case of divorce, it's the same question. Does it go back? It's
the same question whether it goes back. So that's a different question as to whether or not it has now broken the plane, and we say once sold, forever sold, or it has to be a sale. The sale has to go on. My argument would be that once sold, forever sold, because it's the same principle. Now you're going to upend commerce by saying nothing is ever final until it's final. And when is it final? In other words, if we say a sale is final, everybody goes home, everybody knows the story is over. The book is closed, the story is over, move on. But if you're going to say, well, wait a minute, if the husband dies, the story isn't over. The book is still open. And that's going to create the same chaos that we're trying to avoid by saying, you're going to say, it was destined to be because he died, so maybe not, this person now still has rights to it. That's a little bit of a stretch. That's a little bit of a stretch to say that once the transaction happened. Now, you can say the same thing with matana. I give it to you as a matana, and a couple of years later, you and I get in a fight, and you say, here, take your gift back. I don't want your gift, and you throw it back at me. Does that mean that the gift is now undone, and now this particular item goes back into the hopper as a potential as a potential return item, that too is going to become problematic.
It could be combined too. She has it as collateral. She gets married. It's now the husband's property. He's going through all the stuff, and he finds out the story of this, and he's like, well, now it's like, and he says to her, "Wow, wouldn't you like to this to be yours?" And she says, "Yes, it's wonderful, it's beautiful. I really liked it, but it was only collateral when I had it." And he turns around, he's a little chaotic, now turns around and gives it to his wife as a matana.
Yeah, but now it's going there for sure. For sure, it's not collateral because it's already changed its legal shape,
Right.
and whatever happens afterwards is irrelevant. In other words, you can't undo the legal shape. You already gave it to Montana. You can't undo it.
Right. That's my point. As opposed to, but whereas if what we're saying is that potentially, if instead he died before making it a matana,
Right.
now it simply reverts, and yet now we say maybe maybe it's back to collateral.
Maybe she still becomes the controlling. If there's no yarshim and there's nothing.
Question is, does she now own it, or is it now back to collateral?
Right. So that's a very solid, interesting question, which we'll take a look at. I have to go a little bit to understand whether once sold, you've now crossed the divide and you can't go back to the other side of the divide, or whether since it was really dependent on him becoming the owner and he's not the owner. So my understanding would be that it's too late, even though there's no yarshim or anything else. A sale is a sale is a sale by definition. But it's certainly an interesting question to think about, because if he relinquishes it through his own death and there is no yarshim and there's nothing else, then the only person who can really control it is the wife. And in other words, and now someone is timing to her, it's collateral. So what is she going to say? It's my husband's. Well, it's not your husband. Your husband's not alive. The only other terrace is you may be the Yerush to your husband. Remember, she could be the Yerush to her husband. Her husband was the owner because he was a buyer. He died. Who's the Yerush? The wife. So it doesn't go back to becoming collateral. She becomes the successor owner of the sale. You understand? In other words, the sale happened, it's over, and she becomes the successor, the Yerush to the sale, not the original owner who has collateral. That's the chilik here. The chilik is
Yarshim for childless marriages. The Torah creates Yarshim for childless marriage.
And the first Yerush is the wife. The wife is the first Yerush to a childless marriage. In other words, yeah, of course, the wife is the Yerush. So if she's the Yerush, then she's not getting it b'Torah's collateral. She's getting it b'Torah's Yerusha from a sale. It's now 2 steps removed from collateral. So if I come and say, wait a minute, Mrs., this was collateral, I'd like it back. And she says, what do you mean? I sold it to my husband. Your husband is dead. Yeah, but I'm his Yerush. And so it still was sold. The fact that he's not around doesn't mean that you have a right to it. It was sold and I'm his Yerush. So l'chayra, that's the way to think. I want to look further, but l'chayra, that's the way to think about it, because you can't upend the sale. The sale happened. We all agree the sale happened. The fact that the husband's not alive now shouldn't undo the sale. And since the sale is that big divide between collateral and non-collateral, we have to say that it passed from collateral to sale. Now, anything after that is b'Torah's sale. And if she's a Yerush to that sale, then the Malveh, the Lovi can't come back and say, wait a minute, you have it back. I want it back now as collateral, because it lost its status as collateral the minute the husband became a buyer.
So the object changes status.
Say again?
Since we're trying to talk about the object happens to have changed status.
The object changed status and it can't go back into previous status.
Right.
That's correct. So it's a little bit of this is a fascinating discussion, because we have to understand the steps that it takes to go from here to there, and And again, we have this overarching principle which sort of lurks in the background, and it's called a sisa, it's a yashav, it's a type. It's not a hard and fast legal rule. It's a moral clause that two Jews should do the right thing. You might argue to me, the right thing here is for the woman to give it back to the original guy, because he never meant for it to be anything other than collateral. That might be the right thing to do. A sisa is a yashav is a type. But the Torah tells us there's an exception to a sisa as a yashav as a type. As much as you want to be Mr. Nice Guy or Mrs. Nice Guy, the Torah says once it crosses the divide into a sale, a sisa as a yashav as a type doesn't work anymore. Now, you can be lefnim mishur sadin, which the Torah tells us anybody can be lefnim mishur sadin, and you can say, you know what, I'm going to do the right thing. But doing the right thing has nothing to do with this Gemara. This Gemara is trying to give us a definitive answer. What should I do? Not what can I do? You can do a whole lot of things. You can give tzedakah all day long and write mezuzahs and sifrei Torah and be a good guy. But what is it that you halachically should do? And the answer is halachically, you are now removed from having to return it because you now own it definitively. This is a very, conceptually, this is a terrific Gemara to really get into, to understand the balances that we're talking about all the time in real life, in real Jewish life, as to whether or not someone has a moral duty, a legal duty, because it's mine, and how do you balance the two? And then, of course, lurking behind all this is, like we said, lefnim mishur sadin, which the Gemara has told us many, many times, is an answer to a question. You know why he did it? It was lefnim mishur sadin, because he wanted to be extra careful. Well, that you don't legislate. That's something that you can totally do on your own. And if you want to give it up, because hey, do you have to give it up? That's the question.
So this
So we're going to stop here. So this is a fascinating, and we're going to pick up something next week on this, which is equally fascinating. But this whole Gemara right now gives us a concept of what it was like during the time of the Gemara, when people were trying to figure out. Remember, this is Torah Shabbat Peh, so people are trying to codify and put things down to make things so that there should be a normal, quote, normal legal system, not chaotic. It's like the Wild West. Today I'll do it, tomorrow I won't do it. I mean, how do you live that way? You can't live that way. So this is a very good example from the Gemara of how we should do it.
So
Good
definition,
talk, Rabbi.
Yeah.
definition of medaf halten cup.
Without Halton Cup. Yeah.
This is the